The North American survey results this year pretty much confirmed the kind of things you've been reading about in the media, that the North American economy, the U.S. economy in particular, is in a slow growth mode, and I think the industry is in a slow growth mode. Their projections in terms of industry growth rates are down substantially over the last several years, but they're still double or triple what the projections are for GDP growing. And in the past year in particular, they noticed that nobody in the industry who was involved in the survey reported their companies lost money during the year, even though many of those companies didn't hit their revenue targets. And that says that these companies are becoming a lot better at adjusting the level of activity based on what the customer demand looks like. Also, the kind of things that we saw was they continue to focus on things like environmental sustainability, despite the fact that doesn't necessarily get you business in this industry at this particular point in time. And they broadened their service offerings as well, and so they were pretty much in line with the kind of expectations we had going into the year. Well, we have been climbing back slowly, and 2011 was a relatively good year for the group of companies that we surveyed, and in the opinions of the CEOs, was a relatively good year for the North American industry as well. There are concerns, however, that they've started to see some slowdown in the second half of 2012, and there are a lot of uncertainties going into 2013, which I think have acted to hold down the projections they've given us with respect to growth rates for 2013. So much of what happens here is going to be contingent on things that happen in other parts of the world. If the Eurozone financial situation gets worse, that affects us as well because the economies are so closely linked to each other. The CEOs who are involved in the North American survey are clearly concerned about the uncertain economic conditions, not only in the United States, but in particular looking at Europe at this particular point in time. And they're concerned from the standpoint of it's become very difficult to forecast demand for services. And the traditional benchmarks that you've used for forecasting, most of the CEOs involved in our surveys have said they don't work anymore. So to a certain extent, you're trying to become as agile as possible and as sort of capital light as you can so that you can adjust your activity level to what your demand level is at any particular point in time. So that is a major dynamic in this industry at this point. Well, there were relatively few surprises in the results this year. One of the things that was a little bit surprising, however, was the fact that quite a few of the CEOs mentioned this concept of nearshoring. We've been focusing some attention on that for the last 3 years, and clearly there's a lot of discussion of that going on at this point in time, and it would have very significant implications to these companies in terms of what they do. There would be less emphasis on supporting manufacturing firms offshore, distant in Asia at this point in time, and more emphasis on possibly cross-border management of flows from Mexico or flows from South America as well. So that's something which has picked up steam, at least in terms of interest levels over the last several years, and that was somewhat surprising in terms of the frequency with which that was mentioned. What you would find is if this nearshoring becomes a more significant factor than it has up to this particular point in time, it has all sorts of implications in terms of the carriers that you're interacting with, the customs officials you're dealing with, the flows that you're managing at that particular point in time. So just about everything that you do to support customers changes somewhat when the geography in which those customers are situated changes as well. One thing that has been consistent throughout the years is when you talk about the problems that companies have in this industry, one of the predominant problems is how do we find and keep management talent and operating talent. And this is not only in North America, it's true in Europe, it's true in Asia as well. And so what you find is we surveyed the CEOs this year about initiatives that they'd undertaken with respect to human resource management issues. And we found that many of these companies have put new recruiting vehicles in place, often relying upon social media, new training programs in place, and new retention programs in place. So that is an ongoing problem for this industry to face, and some of it, I think, primarily can be traced back to the uncertainty of the economy and the fact that no more than 5, 6 years ago we had a major economic downturn, and a lot of these companies let people go. And people who were let go by the industry at that time have long memories in terms of whether they want to come back into the industry, particularly given the global economic uncertainties. One of the issues that comes into play is trying to go through this corporate analysis of where to spend money on technology. And it's not cheap, generally speaking, but we see technology changing with respect to transportation vehicles, with respect to material handling systems and distribution centers, with respect to certainly the IT space and the development of software to basically do just about anything you can think of from a supply chain management standpoint. And it's been an issue in this industry for a number of years because Customers tend to want more sophisticated IT solutions in particular, but aren't necessarily wild about the idea of paying for it. And so if you are a large third-party logistics company, there's a lot of pressure in the marketplace to have leading-edge IT support capabilities, but the question is, how do you pay for that over time? Many large third-party logistics companies look at the healthcare industry as an industry which would be a very important target to them in terms of supporting future growth. All of the dialogue we have going on in the United States about healthcare programs and support certainly play into this. So what we found this year was that most of the companies involved in the North American survey already have clients in the healthcare industry. And it's a very broadly defined industry. So some have clients in the medical devices sector, other in pharmaceuticals, other in distributors, and a very limited number in servicing hospitals at this particular point. And the services they provide cover a broad range, anything from transportation and warehousing to supporting cold chain activities. And they're looking at this as being an increasingly significant part of their total revenue base over time. At the same time, I think they're somewhat concerned about what is it going to take to play in this marketplace. In many cases, to play this game seriously, you have to make a significant capital investment, which tends to be long-term in nature, and at the same time, the contracts you're signing with some of these companies in the industry are relatively short-term in nature. So to a certain extent, there's real risk associated with becoming a significant player in this marketplace. Oh, there's a strong connection between economic health of a country and supply chain management expenditures. And I think that when we're in an up economy, 3PL companies tend to get more business, and they tend to get better business over time as well. And there's not as much concern on the customer's behalf with respect to pricing. In a down economy, your customers are having financial pressures put on them, which they turn around and pass along to you. And you also tend to find volumes falling off, and now you're trying to figure out, what do I do about asset utilization, and how do I address shrinking margins? What does this mean from pricing perspective, and what does it mean for us in terms of exploring new market opportunities?